Thanks, Zoom. Cool. Right. So I'm going to just start with the quick, okay, there's still people coming in. But yeah, I'm going to just start with a quick little summary of what we're up to and the kind of context of the session. So we started a very ambitious idea of doing a webinar a month on a different topic about peatlands about 10 months ago. This was like a meeting that we had one time, and we were like, this is the best thing, this is the best idea ever, this is like super easy. And I guess that's also kind of telling of our maybe slight naivety, but also just kind of a passion for this subject, where we think, oh my god, there's so many things that we can connect peatlands to, and we've met so many people, and everyone also really and everyone we meet just seems so receptive and so kind of open to spending their own time, spending their Tuesday evening talking about peatlands, and that's kind of been our experience. So that's also just like super inspiring. But yeah, so essentially we've done this is our 8th episode on peatlands, and this is the episode on time, which is a little bit different to a lot of the other episodes, which are maybe a bit more strategic or a little bit more kind of factual or expected, I suppose, maybe kind of grounded in something that you can do or act. And I think time also has that to it, but it's, I don't know, I think a little bit more maybe philosophic and reflective. So I'm really excited about this session, and I'm so happy that we kept this into our list of peatlands, and because I think it's actually, if not the most important, funnily enough. And yeah, so we're really happy to have Melanie and Abby today talking in the session, and I'm just going to quickly outline what the plan is. So the first part is we're going to play this audio, which unfortunately it was going to be a video, but it didn't get made in time, so it's now going to be an audio. And this is a story that we wrote, which was connected to trying to communicate the time element of being a young person at COP, and also thinking about peatlands at COP, and the kind of the contrast, but also the connection between these two things. And we thought the best way of communicating this is to try and write a story which is connecting these two things together. So we're going to play that. And then we're going to go to Melanie, and Melanie actually has to leave a little bit early. So if you have questions for Melanie, then please write them in the chat during her session, and she'll answer them just after her talk. And then in having a little break between Melanie and Abby, we're going to also play a video that we also created for COP in Glasgow, which a few of us were at. And this is also about kind of connecting this kind of these different timescales and these different urgencies. So we'll play that for you as well. And then Abby will do her talk, and we'll have a discussion afterwards. And we expect it to probably take less than an hour and a half, but we left loads of time in case the conversation goes really wild and everyone's really into it, because time is a good conversation. So yeah, welcome to the session, and I'm going to start off with playing this audio if I can. So in fact, I haven't practiced this sharing audio, so this will be a new thing. So share sound, and now not sure if this is the best way of playing it, but I'm gonna just maybe go on to this. I don't want to share my screen, that's the thing. But okay, I'm gonna just share my screen and we'll play it from my iMovie. And when I play it, I'm gonna ask if someone can just tell me that they hear it.
I was born in 1995.
Can someone hear it?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, cool.
I was born in 1995, the year of the first UN climate conference in Germany, COP1.
I was born at the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 years ago.
My parents tell me I didn't like being a baby. I just wanted to speak. I remember growing up, I was always trying to figure everything out.
The land took a new shape. As the soil became submerged in water, layers of plant matter built up within.
All the facial expressions around the dinner table, all the implications, all of the reasons that people gave and all the wisdom, all the confusing feelings and the forgotten memories and the unthinkable mysteries.
All of the sphagnum mosses forming, creating my carbonic mass, all of the implications, all of the harsh conditions that gave pulse to unusual plants, all the pollen that is drawn into my layers, all the creatures that roam across my surface, and the memories of a world recorded.
The world I sprung up into seemed to be so ever complex and illogical. How could it be that history had happened, yet I could scarcely see the remains? I would hear tales of old ways of being and dressing, funny ways of speaking and eating, and learn about landscapes that once were.
The ecosystem we created was reliant on so many specific conditions. How could it be that my very body was exactly the source of my demise? I find joy and pain around me. I have made myself from nuclear bombs and curious footprints, human sacrifices and butter, soil and water.
So much has changed in my tiny life. It was like I was living in the crescendo moment when the tree of history was bearing down with fruit, its vivid leaves all fiery red, looking mighty before they drop.
I am composing a eulogy to decomposition. I am a choir singing it, shouting it. There is a future. There has been a past. Let me into your future. Let yourself into your future. Your future is unfolding in front of you right now in this present moment.
We weren't like tigers, sharks, alligators or eagles. We were like the monkeys always running through the trees, dreaming of falling. When I was about 10, I learned that humans were affecting the climate. I'm not sure who first told me that story, but I remember after hearing it, I would think about buying a boat for my family and friends to protect them, like Noah did with his ark. At 15, I lost all motivation to act because I felt I had no power.
People have power. They seem to recognize this when it comes to destruction, but not so often when it comes to regeneration. They have the power to break down the systems they are stuck in. They have the power to create worlds of thriving species.
I can feel the changes bubbling. I can feel the tide turning.
I can feel the changes bubbling. I can feel the tide turning.
Now is the time.
Mm.
So yeah, apologies for not having a video and having that on my iMovie, but you can get a bit of a sense of what we were trying to communicate, and trying to get that contrast between the slow voice and the kind of that sort of fluctuating knowledge of the peatland throughout those many years, thousands, tens of thousands of years that land has existed and that it's kind of seen, and understanding the power that humans have had throughout that period. So you can imagine, like, peatlands have kind of seen humans throughout lots of different phases that we've been in as a species, and now they're seeing this specific kind of power that we have, which is quite urgent, or which is quite big. And I guess, like, contrasting that with the kind of experience of a young person growing up and maybe not having that knowledge, but also kind of coming into an awareness of also that power that everyone has. So that was a little bit what we wanted to try and get across with that story. So yeah, and now I'm gonna pass the mic to Melanie, and I'm gonna read just a short description of what she's going to talk about today. So Melanie is a specialist in the archaeology of the Iron Age, and she's based at the University of Manchester. And she just finished a recent study on the archaeological value of peatlands, explored through the lens of the iconic phenomenon of bog bodies. And her book, which can be read online or downloaded, covers aspects of their discovery and conservation and different interpretations of these human remains, as well as other artifacts deposited in bogs, alongside a wider appraisal of the meaning of peatlands in prehistoric communities. She will talk briefly about the value of this archaeology, including its potential to inspire more creative engagements, such as the Bright Edge Deep online exhibition. And yeah, we're really happy to have you here, Melanie. And if anyone has any questions, just put them in the chat while we're talking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to start sharing my screen, hopefully, and I'll just do that. Right. So I'm hoping somebody will leap in if you can't see this, but thank you very much for the invitation to talk this evening. I work on the Iron Age, and I work on bogs and what we find in them. So I'm just going to share a little bit of a sense of what they meant to people in the past and how we can use that, I think, in the present. I'm going to start with an image of the very first set of human remains that I can find that have been illustrated or drawn from a bog. This is the hand of Amcot's woman, and it was painted in these beautiful watercolour peaty tones by Mr. George Vertue, Secretary to the Society of Antiquaries, back in 1747, when they were sent the hand and the sandal of a woman who came from this set of bogs in around Amcot's in Lincolnshire. And I find these illustrations movingly human. The way in which the hand of this woman survives to kind of reach out through time, as Abby Flint, who'll speak after me, put it when we discussed this together, a hand asks for a hand. And it is that sense of a hand reaching across time to us that I think motivates many of us archaeologists to speak on behalf of the dead, but also reach out, as you have so eloquently put it already tonight, to the future. Many of you will know that peat is an excellent preserver. The raised bog in particular, but also blanket bogs and fens, have a peculiar property that antiquarians have been puzzling over for many years, whether this was due to their antiseptic quality or the resinous quality of the trees that often formed the basal layer of the peat. There was a knowledge that things that were in its waters, either put there or fell in accidentally, were marvellously preserved. Now, we now know that that's a complex reaction of the sphagnic acids forming polysaccharides that create this kind of tanning effect. And it's a combination of those biochemical and geochemical reactions with the water and the very cold anaerobic conditions that preserve organic remains that fall into their depths. We've been fascinated by this in archaeology for a very long time. Here we have the very first archaeology documentary series, Buried Treasure, episode 2. Episode 1 was about the big science of archaeology, a big theme in the 1950s, but episode 2 leapt straight into the phenomenon of bog bodies. Poor Stonehenge only fell to episode 3. And you can see here the great characters of Glendaniel, Mortimer Wheeler, and a one early experimental archaeologist, Noel Middleton, who cooked up Grauballer Man's last meal. But many of you will know of the bog people through this book by P.V. Glob, translated into English in 1969, and this was the volume that inspired Seamus Heaney to use the bog people to speak back to contemporary concerns around violent death and loss and execution and sacrifice, and these themes continue to haunt our interpretation of these remains. When we deal with bog bodies in a museum setting, one of the things that we acknowledge but rarely put up in big posters is that our archaeological work involves trying to stop time yet again once things come out of the bog at us. Our conservation science is needed to curate and continually slow the decay that these remains begin again once they're out of the peaty depths. But rather than seeing this as a kind of sleight of hand or deceit, I think this is a peculiar kind of care that we give to the dead, and that story too should feature in the narratives we tell around these individuals, where our present collides and intersects with the lives of those from the past. In Britain, bog bodies became a big theme in the 1980s through a series of case studies from Lindo Moss in Cheshire. Paper bog bodies have been known for some time, preserved because we didn't have the conservation science to curate them. Gallerman in Ireland was an interesting exception there. But in the 1980s, an active murder case brought the attention of the police to a set of remains found on Lindo Moss. She was eventually dated to the Roman period rather than a recent murder victim. But that started a series of discoveries which totaled at least 3, possibly 4 bog bodies, the most famous of which is known as Pete Marsh, who resides in the British Museum. Bogs, as archaeologists started to think about them, had not had a good press in the cultural imagination of the general public. They're used to describe pejorative ideas and peoples. Here are a couple of quotes from the 17th and 19th centuries about the way in which people view bogs, their marginal nature, the way in which they're perceived as wastes, to be got rid of, to be drained, to be milled away within the discourse on environmental improvement, which wanted to turn these into productive land. And we can see those ideas very much peddled in the work of people like Bram Stoker or Conan Doyle, or Swift's Tale of the Tub, where the bog stood as a pejorative stand-in for the people that you would find in and around them. And in my own area around Manchester, here are a couple of rather nasty pieces of local ethnography about the Little Moss Gorbies from Ashton-under-Lyne and the inhabitants of Lindo Moss, describing them effectively as Aboriginal communities lurking on the fringe of civilised society. Yet, as Matthew Hyde and Christine Pemberton's wonderful study of Lindo has revealed, these bog warriors, as they like to call themselves, were actually the marginalised fringes of communities that had been disenfranchised of their common land, or neglected by society as they returned from conflict, or found a way of life on the bog that they could continue to enjoy, even though they were poor and of little means, and it gave them a place to dwell outside of normal society. They weren't the remnants of an Aboriginal community in Britain from prehistory. But the qualities of the bog have always given it this almost supernatural and untrustworthy nature. Bogs, as you know, are often referred to as quaking or shaking bogs. And the bog bursts, such as this one reported on Chat Moss from the 1600s, records the violence with which these landscapes can suddenly erupt, spewing peat across productive agricultural land. And as the local inhabitants in 1526 put it, they thought it was doomsday and the end of the world was upon them, which may be a familiar feeling from those of you who've attended COP recently. Strange things were seen on the moss and strange beings were thought to live there. The Ignis Fatuus or jack-o'-lantern or corpse lights that danced flickeringly across the bogs, we probably know are now biochemical or biogeochemical reactions to an environment under extreme stress. We don't see these lambent flickering flames anymore, but they certainly gave these places a rather sinister reputation. And locally in Ashton-under-Lyne, you can see Boggart's house on the edge of the moss, these malign little wet devils who were thought to be up to no good, that came from the bog. And locally, the King of Droylsden, Jem Hill, used to fight with these creatures. And we've also got an example there of a boggart seer who used to combat with these fearin. So they are, by the historic period, a malign place to be avoided, where bad things happen to you. But how did prehistoric people see the bog? The first millennium BC, the period I work mostly in, the Iron Age, saw a major change in environmental factors. Solar forcing and climate change caused a downturn of temperature and increased precipitation that increased the growth of the bogs exponentially. And this is a still from the museum at Mosgard in Aarhus of the entrance into the Iron Age gallery, which conjures the simple fact that in Denmark and other low-lying areas, up to anywhere around a third of productive agricultural land was lost to the bogs as they grew and swallowed the field systems of the Bronze Age. And it's that context that we need to understand in terms of what Iron Age people were doing there. So how can archaeology make us see these places differently? How did Iron Age people see them? We know that they are cutting peat for fuel from the late Bronze Age at least onwards, possibly before that. We have these little hand-pressed turf stacks in the Hebrides and Denmark, and turf cutting tools that tell us about people's interactions with the peat that's already well decomposed and how they used it for their own fuel. We know they're going out there to collect mosses, probably for medicine, rushes and reeds. They are going there to capture fowl that seasonally rested on it. And substances like sphagnum, of course, have natural medicinal properties. They weren't just used in the First World War as naturally antiseptic and hyperabsorbent dressings. I was speaking to a local archaeology community in Driffield recently, where their local dentist continues to use sphagnum moss as a temporary dressing for his dentistry work. In the Iron Age, there are also cuttings, species like Polytrichommune, to make extraordinary basketry and this wonderful piece of headgear, a hair cap, as John Peter Wilder's described it, from Vindolanda Roman fort, tells us of the extraordinary vegetal textiles you make using these species. And John Peter has humorously described this as a head covering that a foreign Roman soldier might have sought out, not just to keep off the rain on the wall, but perhaps to keep out that most insidious of Scottish enemies, the midge. Mm-hmm. But one of the main things that they're going into the bog for during the Iron Age is iron. Bog ore is one of the best sources of iron for making tools and weapons, and this is something.
Sorry, Melanie, I've just accidentally muted you.
Yes, so they're going to cut the ore and they're using this to make their iron tools and weapons. And that, of course, means that they're beginning to change their relationship with it. They are extracting things from it. And this might help explain some of the discrepancy in dates we see between features in which we find some of our bog bodies, where the peat cutting is much older than the remains that get deposited in them. Peat bogs, particularly in Ireland and Scotland, have yielded some of the most fantastic Iron Age archaeology we have. Raised trackways or corduroy roads like Corlay in Ireland, which we can date with pinpoint accuracy to 148 to 147 BC. This tells us about the places, the routeways that people were designing across the bog, not just to cross it, but to go right into its depths. They're also putting things in the care of the bog. Bog butter was mentioned in your film, and we see this real spike in the deposition of churns or vats of butter during the Iron Age, possibly as a temporary place for cold storage to put butter by for times of dearth, but also probably for offerings to the gods in thanksgiving for the things that have been taken from it. And our composite body from Cladhallen, a late Bronze Age site up in the Hebrides, tells us that occasionally human remains were temporarily curated in the bog as well, as a way of dealing with stopping time, intervening with time. I think they must have thought of themselves as time lords to some extent, as a way of creating more complex mortuary rites and composite ancestors. So they were aware, I think, of its extraordinary properties at this time. It wasn't just bog butter they took back to the bogs. There were cauldrons, there were shields, there were weapons, there were golden torques in the Stirlingshire hoard up near Flanders Moss. Plaits of hair have been found in Denmark, and staked animals with clubs lying alongside them are a particular feature of the Swedish bogs. And archaeologists have puzzled long and hard about what was going on here. We think that these are deliberate offerings back to the bog, perhaps in thanksgiving for what has been taken, where it tells us that these bogs are seen as portals or thresholds between realms where you might communicate with the gods, or where the supernatural was indeed imminent, a place of hierophany, we might call it. And many of these objects are beautiful, fine, the very best craftsmen could make, but many of them are also old and worn and used and redolent with life. And this might be an important part of how those associations with people made these especially powerful offerings, through which, in the act of sacrifice, their vitality and their fertility was reaped through the giving up of these things and the giving over of them to the. So what about our human remains? Some of them we know are simply accidents, people lost in bad weather. Nat Bell and Radcliffe unwisely attempting to cross Lindo Moss whilst loaded with ale, or accidents as people tried to cross them in times of need. People fled into the moor or the bog to escape enemies. They were also hidden perhaps in the bog as a result of domestic violence or even murder. And the bog was thought to be a peculiarly suitable place to put the remains of the Covenanters in Scotland. It was also, for some individuals, the only place they could go when they despaired of life, as the sad case of poor Mary Daniel tells us, who drowned herself in a pit on Duckenfield Moor after she had finished her milking. And that was a particular account that really pulled at my heartstrings. But when it comes to our Iron Age bodies, it is the classical authors' accounts that have particularly been drawn upon to tell us that this could be a suitable form of punishment for particular crimes, or an act of sacrifice, either for divination by the northern barbarians, or even for scapegoating, for heaping the ills of society upon a poor unfortunate soul who might already be singled out by virtue of a natural deformity or a rather disadvantaged part of life, which led to their final demise. But Ned Kelly over in Ireland has argued from the life histories of some of these individuals that they often come from the very top echelons of society, They've often had good diets. They're pretty healthy. Some of them are physically impressive. And he suggested some of them are indeed failed kings whose time has come to an end, or seized enemy warriors who'd had to die as part of earning renown on behalf of the tribe who'd taken him captive. Lindoman is one of the best examples we have for the suggestion of a sacrifice who dies a particularly kind of sudden and violent death. But it's also possible that some of these individuals go, if not exactly willingly, perhaps knowingly to their death. Many of them have been prepared in terms of neatly trimmed beards or last meals, such as Moydrum Man here, who's eaten over 200 slow stones, presumably not soaked in delicious gin, but perhaps no less an important meal at a time of dearth. In my own institution, I've been working on a boghead known as Worsley Man, building on research by other scholars. And we found out that our boghead, who again dies a rather violent death from a massive head wound, a wound behind the ear, and final decapitation, dates actually to the Roman period. And in his case, he's got to be set back in the context of the Roman occupation of the north, a time of violence and change. This is Insus, the cavalry rider, an auxiliary officer who's come to live in the north of Britain, who dies whilst in service and commissions as his tombstone a picture of himself on horseback brandishing a decapitated head of a local. I can't help but delight in the fact that soon after this was erected, it was toppled over, and he himself was rather symbolically decapitated in terms of his tombstone effigy. But certainly whatever Worsley Man was, whether he was an honoured local elite leader who had to die at the hands of the Romans, whether he was a cattle thief or a murderer, or whether he was just caught up in the contentious politics of the time, Worsley Man's story has to be situated within those colonial contexts. So I just want to leave you with a sense of why archaeologists have been talking about bog bodies so much recently. Well-preserved human remains are one of the most contentious bits of the past that we can put on display. Worsley Man himself disappeared from the Manchester Museum's gallery during what Tiffany Jenkins has called a crisis of confidence about the display of human remains. But they've always inspired a sense of ownership and feeling and actually affection up here in the north. Lindo Man was the subject of a vigorous campaign by the local primary school to keep him north. And these accounts of the screaming skull, or as I prefer to call it, the charming head, tell us about people who found bog heads or bog remains, who felt that their duty is to care for them and keep them in their own house and keep them close to their family, not as curious antiquarian relics, but as lucky charms, residents from the past who continue to bring good fortune to those who show them respect and care. So we've been thinking long and hard about how we create encounters with the dead, giving people a choice as to whether to meet these bog bodies. This is the final resting place of Grauballerman in that Mossgard museum. And also how we communicate their life stories to others. The violence that many of them saw should appall and shock us, as should these different relationships and different ways of seeing the bog, not as a negative place to be drained and got rid of, but a productive place with which we need to deal respectively. So I would argue that they have the power to both appall and impel us towards a rather different future. I don't need to tell this audience why bogs matter in the present, but this is the contemporary landscape of Lindo Moss, where the local planning group have agreed to turn it back over to regeneration in order to try and act as a local carbon sump. And I think Nikki Whitehouse might be with us tonight, but one of the things that we can do to try and encourage those new conversations is to bring to people a deeper sense of the cultural life of the bog and the rich relationships we have had with them to make us see them again differently in the present. And to that end, it is more creative engagements that I've been working with Rose Ferraby recently on ways of representing the bog bodies that capture more of these places, and the bog matter and the forms that we find within them to create new relationships with the dead. So if you'd like to find out more, you can download this for free. It's fairly cheap too, but I hope that that's given you a little taste of why I find this topic so fascinating and why I think it matters right now.
I see some clapping going on by Rosie. Melanie, that was absolutely amazing. I feel like I've been toured around a whole museum, and that's quite like a long time since I've done that for lockdown, which was also is just really nice. And the way that you told the story and in the kind of layers that it has, one of the things that stood out to me was this kind of like looking at history and trying to figure out how that responds to the future, and this kind of like what should we take and what should we and maybe what can we learn. So for example, like some of the things you said was like that you use something so long and then you give it back to the bog, and the idea of like using it is for that duration of time adds value to it. And I think that's something that in these days quite often, like the shorter you use it is often like kind of that if you have something super worn out, it's maybe not valued so much. And I think this kind of looking back to that mentality is also super powerful. And this idea of like giving like reciprocity to the things that the wetland gives to you, not just because you want to bury your loved ones, but also just because you want to appreciate that kind of interaction. I think that's also super valuable. But then also what you said about this kind of like colonial legacy and how do we look at these maybe not so nice parts of history and also learn how to undo these power relations and undo these kind of not so nice parts about our possibilities as humans. So yeah, thank you for that. And if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat, and I will pass them on to Melanie now. There's a few coming in now. So Deborah writes, fascinating talk, thanks Melanie, very evocative and poetic, and enjoyed the journey of the passion of the bogs from contemporary writing to academia and archaeology, transforming our past, present and future. So that's more of a statement. It was nice. And Rosie asked, Mel, what I found really interesting in your talk is how we bring back a sense of the physicality of these things, people and peat, and how we tell these stories. In what way would you like to tell some of these stories?
Thanks, Rose. That's a good question. I think what struck me is, how could I persuade Manchester Museum to put Worsley Man back on display? Would I? And if I did, how would I do it? And I think conjuring that sense of landscape is really important to understanding why he's there. He's not the prettiest of bog remains. I mean, my front cover of my book is Tolland Man, and we could have another lecture about whether that was a good thing or bad thing to put a body on the front of my book. I'd robustly defend it because Iron Age people were well into that. They were interacting with human remains in all ways. But I think if you want people to understand that the bog is a productive place in the Iron Age, and yet already we can see, Ben Geary's work, Henry Chapman's work, Nikki Whitehouse is here tonight. Their research has proved that people in the Iron Age were already doing stuff that was really risky and sometimes caused bog bursts or started to change that environment. We need to capture that better, because people can get too easily hooked on the sacrifice, and rather than understanding that ecological dynamic and that to and fro of give and take. So I think I would like to tell stories that give the context, both an understanding of the context of your relationship with the landscape at the time, and also what you think you're doing when you sacrifice something and give it up and give it over, and how humans are part of that wider world of what David Fontaine would call a sacrificial economy. And it's a very different logic to ours, and some of it's really nasty, and so we shouldn't shy away from that by saying, look, that that is really, using violence as a tool of power is not something that I would promote and condone. but to them it was part of the logic of their lives. So I think I try and understand more about the context of lives and deaths and the landscape. But some of that's best done creatively. It's not best done didactically. And so and ultimately, you know, we're, as academics, we're being asked, you know, what's your work for? Why does it matter? So how do you take those messages and make them meaningful and useful in the present? And one of the things we can do is we can use those, you know, when you look at the Gundestrup Cauldron or the Stirlingshire Hoard, these are extraordinarily enchanting objects, and that work of re-enchanting people with these places and saying, okay, our job now is to re-wet them and regenerate them and care for them in a different way, but from their depths come these extraordinary things that can make us interested in them more. And I think that's the job of the past now, is to re-enchant us with those places. And some of that's best done through poetry and art.
We're on the right track then. I also think it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about this idea of like sacrifice and like the negative as well, because I think this is something that is going to become more and more and more important as we face this you know, global scale crisis, multiple crises, and the idea of like the sacrifice, I think, is really coming forward again into like people's perception of, yeah, what does that actually mean to like sacrifice? And yeah, right now of like there's strong like racial dynamics to, you know, who are we sacrificing in this crisis and things like this. So I think that's really interesting that as we tell the story again of like, what does that actually mean? I'm going to go on to the next question. So hi Mel, I love the notion of bogs as portals into other worlds, maybe of the dead. This reminds me of very deep bog pools that have disappeared from many of our bogs. Do you think this might be important, maybe important components of the bog that may be linked to more strongly to the underworld?
Yeah, so the thing I cut for my presentation, because it was far too long already, there was a lovely map that has been studied in a wonderful article on kind of, you know, 17th, 18th century relations with bogs, of I think it's Wymot Moss in West Lancashire, which shows these features called hellholes. And the author of that article argues that these might be places where supernatural entities might be thought to kind of pop up, or where you could communicate with them. And various writers talk about these deep pools, these still pools that look like black eyes, into which you could hide things or sink things, or, you know, there is a particular fascination for them. So I think, and of course an old peat cutting would form that place, and they are on Wymot Moss, they are circular. They are clearly one of the earliest sets of features on the bog, and they're very different from the peat rooms, the moss rooms that characterize the later cutting. So yeah, and certainly we know Grauwellerman, Tollandman, and there's one of the female bog bodies. They're in these tub cuttings on the Danish bogs. So I think that probably explains the discrepancies in the Lindoman dates, but I've yet to have that discussion with other people. But, I can see another question there about iron ore, why iron ore is found in bogs. So basically what happens is you get kind of mineralized iron concretion precipitating out in the bog, because as they form these sealed kind of contexts, the water can't leach away. That's the whole point. They're cut off from groundwater, and you get this precipitate. So you get this crunchy iron bog ore layer. And there's a wonderful statistic by Peter Halkin, who's looked at rates of bog ore growth around the Fulney Valley, where he talks about, you know, drainage pipes that have been laid by farmers in the, you know, 40s, 50s. By the 70s, they're choked up with bog ore. It grows that fast. And locally there, it's called the Norseman, because presumably the Vikings in that area were going into the bog to get their ore too. But it's particularly good ore for ironworking when you're doing the small scale smelting and smithing that Iron Age people and up to more recent ironworking processes were using. And then I can see there's a comment there about basketry and crafts. Yes, so I've got some references. If you download the kind of the volume, There are some wonderful crannog sites, particularly in Ireland, where you get these woven kind of sphagnum moss kind of materials. The hat, and there's also a helmet crest from Vindelander. They're on the Vindelander website, I think, but also they're studied by John Peter Wilde, and I think some of those articles are out there on academia. For an insight into the world of organic materials, although it's not a raised bog area, Glastonbury and Mere Lake Village just gives us a tiny insight into what was once there. And for anyone who doesn't yet know about Must Farm, the peaty riverine deposits there, more fen really, not raised bog, so they're more alkaline than acid. We are about to have our archaeological world blown open wide by what they were doing with vegetable organic fibre in the late Bronze Age, and so we're all very excited about that at this end.
I'm aware that you might need to go in a second. Do you want to just answer one more question? Or
Let's look. What with the spooky fairy lights? So they're not. Yeah, people think that it's something combusting, some methane gas or something like that. But in fact, it's this. It's a concept. It's called an extremophile, and these are hypothesized as biogeochemical reactions of environments under stress. Milton writes about it in Paradise Lost. He describes them. People have different words for it: corpse lights, ghost lights, will-o'-the-wisps, but we don't see them anymore, and that's because we've wrecked our environment. So I think they're indicative of that, of all these bogs being cut and cut and cut away, and it's something that was once seen that we don't see. Maybe we'll see them again if we regenerate our bogs. Maybe we will see them again.
amazing. I had no idea about this. It's like a whole realm of discovery there. Thank you so much, Melanie. That was really interesting and wealth of knowledge. So just before we go on to Abby, I'm going to play this video that we created, which I mentioned before, which is, and if there's any other questions, maybe we can also email you, Melanie, just thought. And yeah, so it's basically, I think the title is Youth Sense, and it's kind of just, it's a collection of different people describing their senses, and I'm just going to play it rather than describing it and ruining it. So here we go. Let me just put it on to okay. Shout out if the audio is not working for some reason.
We are youth. We see, we hear, we smell, we touch, we speak.
We see bare lands due to massive deforestation and wildfires.
We see the vegetation shifting due to warmer climate and drier peat.
We see the connection between the stories we tell and the worlds we create.
We hear the calling of birds whose habitats are diminishing.
We hear policymakers talking about climate restoration, but climate is destroyed more.
We hear tales of mismanagement, corruption, and destruction. But we also hear tales of co-creation, regeneration, and resistance.
We smell the smoke from wildfires in this peatlands.
We smell the stagnant air of endless political negotiations, with no willpower for change.
We smell the soggy earth, the sour water, and the floral air.
We touch the dried up vegetation of the drained bogs.
We touch the soft pillars of sphagnum mosses growing on a damp peat soil.
We touch to let our bodies think the peatland.
We speak to those in power, demanding action, not just words.
We speak with urgency and with clarity about where we need to be.
We speak for those who have a different language, the language of the birds, the willows and sedges, who tell us that these ecosystems need our protection.
We touch, and we are touched in return.
We speak and wait to be listened to.
So that was the youth sense, collaborative youth sense. Yeah, I'm gonna now pass the mic over to Abby. So just quickly, a description of what Abby's going to talk about today. So Abby Flint is a heritage researcher with a background in archaeology and a long-standing research interest in human-environment relationships. As a research associate in the In All Our Footsteps project in Newcastle University, her current work explores the meaning and value that rights of way hold for people. Also, as a poet, Abby is passionate about the potential of poetry to engage people with research and as research process itself. In this short talk, we'll share how she uses poetic transcriptions in the Wet Futures project in the University of Bradford to explore how people engage with and perceive the peatland landscape of Ilkley Moor, in brackets West Yorkshire, and its rich cultural and natural heritage. Abby will introduce the project and share some of the poems created. So over to you, Abby.
Thanks very much, and thanks Melanie for a fantastic talk about bog bodies and all things peatland archaeology. That's great to set the scene for this. So I'm just going to share my slides. And thank you also for the wonderful story and the video that you've shared as well from the RE-PEAT work. It was really powerful. So I'm going to move on from how people in the past might have thought about peatlands to think about how people in the present relate to peatlands and their history today. So I'm going to talk about a research project that I was involved in from 2020 to August this year at the University of Bradford called Wet Futures. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how I used poetry as a research method and output as part of a qualitative exploration of what peatlands and their heritage mean to people. But first, I want to start with one of the poems. So I'm going to read 4 poems throughout the presentation today. And all of these are created solely from the words of my research participants using a technique called poetic transcription, which I'll say a little about later. But first, I want to invite you to spend a moment with the way that this person engaged with peatlands and how they personally engage with peatlands and some of the environmental challenges that might face them. So I'll move on so that you can see the poem on the screen as well, hopefully. There we go. Mother Nature. I feel very much part of the moorland landscape. The way it behaves, seasons affect me. I share its vulnerability. Mother Nature does what Mother Nature wants. We have to accept that. The autumn mist, the snow, we get proper winters up here. A beautiful place, but not all respect it. Seeing what humans do to the environment, sometimes I have to switch off. It's a lot of things to a lot of people. What some believe to be a natural environment is actually far from it. Sphagnum moss, a plant important for the health of wetland, for carbon as flood control. If we drain the moor, we lose that benefit. Do you take your hands off the steering wheel? Let Mother Nature take complete control? Or do you have a hand on the tiller? We are fumbling our way through. So I'm going to talk about how I've used poetry in the context of a wetland heritage research project called Wet Futures. And Wet Futures was a project that explored approaches to wetland heritage in the Netherlands, Ireland, and the UK. And I was part of the UK team that was led by Dr. Ben Jennings at the University of Bradford. I was a researcher working with him on it. And in the UK, we looked at 3 different peatland sites: the upland peatland of Ilkley Moor in West Yorkshire, and 2 lowland sites, one in the Somerset Levels, Shapwick Heath, and one in the Humberhead Peatlands, Thorn and Hatfield Moors. And it's the research on Ilkley Moor that the poems that I'm going to share are created from. So I'm just going to say a little bit about Ilkley Moor for those of you that might not be as familiar with the landscape. So it's an upland blanket peatland in West Yorkshire and part of a wider moor known as Rombalds Moor. And it's a very culturally shaped landscape. It's rich in archaeology and history from the Neolithic to the present day. It's especially famous for its prehistoric rock art in the form of cup and ring carved rocks. So this image that you can see in the center of the screen here is one of the rocks that's got these distinctive cut marks, and elsewhere you'll see concentric circles carved on the rocks and some ladder marks too. And also monuments like the 12 Apostles stone circle, which is on the right of the screen here. More recent heritage includes things like quarries, sheep pens, military remains, and also unofficial rock art in the form of Victorian graffiti that's on quite a lot of the rocks across the moor. And in the 19th century, Ilkley became a very popular spa resort. There were a number of hydrotherapy houses that sprung up along the edges of the moor where people as famous as Charles Darwin went for the water cure. But the moor itself, so the peatland walks and the air on the peatland were seen as very much part of the therapeutic landscape at that time and part of the treatment at these hydrotherapy houses. And from the Victorian period onwards, we start to see the moor growing in popularity as a recreational area too. There was even a golf course up there in use until the very early 20th century. Aspect of Ilkley Moor's folklore there is the song on Ilkley Moor, "PEAT," which many of you might have already heard, which also adds to the importance of this particular peatland regionally because it acts as a kind of unofficial Yorkshire anthem. Today, the landscape is an urban common. It's managed by Bradford Council, and it's a very well-used recreational space for walkers, mountain bikers, climbers, nature spotters, and sightseers. So it's a really well-used landscape into the present day, and it's also got literary associations. So it's a landscape that Ted Hughes wrote about in Remains of Elnet, and more recently in 2012, that you can see the image on the left of the slide here is a little box for poems. There was a project called Stanza Stones that the poet Simon Armitage wrote a number of poems for. The poems were carved on rocks and placed across the Pennines, and a few of them are on Ilkley Moor. And he describes this as sort of continuing that dialogue that people have had with the landscape through the nature of carving on stone. So it's got this very long heritage. And before I go on to talk about the poems and read a couple more poems, I'll just say a little bit more about the research that I did as part of the Wet Futures project and what the poems draw on. So my role in the project was to undertake qualitative research to explore how people engage with peatlands and what they thought about them. And there were 4 strands to this. So I looked at what the scholarly perspective said about these particular UK peatlands, mainly through looking at literature reviews, so the academic literature, but also looking at what projects and local groups had produced as well. I looked at the professional perspective on peatlands. I spoke to 3 experts from national organisations that have a role in peatlands and their heritage, looked at some of the policy documents around peatlands, and looked at wider public perceptions of these 3 particular peatlands. So one of the things I looked at was visitor reviews on TripAdvisor. I was quite surprised to find that these peatlands had their own little link on TripAdvisor where people had reviewed them. So I looked at that in terms of public perceptions of peatlands, and also looked at how they were covered in newspapers over the last 10 years. And then looked at how people who lived locally to peatlands thought about them. So in part, this was from an online questionnaire that administered at Ilkley Moor and also at Thorn and Hatfield Moor. But the main part that I'm drawn the poems from is from photo elicitation online interviews with 8 people who lived close to Ilkley Moor. So what I mean by photo elicitation interviews is kind of a posh way of saying that I did video interviews with people, and I also asked them to bring along to the interview a few photographs that said something of what Ilkley Moor meant to them personally. And the choice of method was partly due to some of the challenges of conducting research during a pandemic. Initially, I'd hoped to conduct walking interviews with people, so take them out onto Ilkley Moor and for them to talk about what the landscape means to them in situ. Obviously, in lockdown, that posed some serious ethical and practical challenges. So we went to this online method, but I hope that by bringing the photographs, people would share a little bit about what that landscape meant to them. So I'm not going to say much about the research findings today because I want to share the poems and the poetic method a little bit more today. But in terms of a couple of points in the findings, what we found was that people were using peatlands and engaging with them in very different ways. So much as you would expect, they might be out walking, mountain biking. Peatlands are an inspiration for art for people. They might be volunteering there in conservation roles. They might be out collecting berries and edible plants, looking for wildlife, or simply just spending time with family and friends. And for many people, they took part in multiple of these activities. So it's not just simply that some people are walking, some people are mountain biking. Actually, most people are taking part in lots of different activities on peatlands. But the way that people engage with peatlands isn't just about what they're doing there. What came through really strongly in the interview data when I spoke to people was how being in peatlands is a very embodied experience. It's not just about what they did or what they saw, but the sounds that they heard, the textures of vegetation and the smells. And peatlands evoked a very emotional response in people, particularly when they reflected on times that they'd spent there with friends and family. But that sense of being familiar with the landscape also provided a sense of belonging. And for some people, they felt that the peatlands, that Ilkley Moor in particular, was part of what they considered to be home. But most interestingly, I thought, coming from a cultural heritage perspective, and particularly thinking about the time depth of peatlands, is that when people encountered some of this archaeology and history that's present on the peatland of Ilkley Moor, it sparked their curiosity. It made them intellectually engage with the landscape. They wanted to know more about the past of the moor. Some actually started researching it. One person spent most of their lockdowns looking for as many of the carved rocks as they could possibly find. But it also gave a less tangible sense of connection across time with other people who'd shaped the landscape before them or had simply walked up there, lived up there in the past. So the time depth was something which added to people's enjoyment of the moor and also part of what it meant to them too. So these were very rich and varied accounts that I got from the interviews that spoke not just to the physical engagement with the landscape, but this strong personal, emotional, and social connection, that this was a place of memory, a place of spending time with people who meant something to you, a place that allowed people to express and shape parts of their identity. And for some, it was part of home too. So I'm going to read another poem now. And this one, I think, says something about how this time depth of peatlands strengthens people's attachment to place. And it's taken from the words of someone who was very involved and interested in the local history of the area. And I think their words highlight the personal connections that people build with peatlands and their heritage, and how they see that heritage as something that's living, that they can have an active role in too. The continuation of history. It lifts my heart when I look to the hills, sparks my interest when I start digging into it. How the moor has been a background for the lives of other people. I mean, we've got history. You just walk out onto the moor and you hit the history. Mesolithic, Neolithic, Romans, Knights Templars, Normans, you name it, we've got it. Victorians used it on high days and holidays. Then across the moor are tracks with Viking names. A lot of people don't know about it. It's unscheduled, unmarked, just there. You could trip over it. So much of it is still unknown, or if it was known, it's been forgotten. I see myself as playing a part, a small part, reviving those stories, reviving the memories, helping people understand where they live, look after it, create meaning. I have a tiny part to play in that, otherwise all this will be forgotten. It goes back to Middlemarch, how the good of man is promoted by people, unknown people in unknown graves, doing small things for the good. It's the continuation of history, and this is me continuing history with my quiet life. Ilkley Moor is the background to my life. My first house I lived in with my husband, where my son was born, my first grandchild was born. Every event, I've got the moor as the backdrop. Do you see how it's always been there? The background to my life, and my life is a continuation of history. So why did I decide to use poetry in a research project about the heritage of peatlands? Well, firstly, I was already writing poetry outside of work, and archaeology and landscapes often made their way into my poems because these were things I cared about. And I'd begun to start bringing poetry and research into closer connection. And one aspect of this was to see how poetry might be a creative way of sharing the outcomes of research. Not everybody wants to read an academic paper. So my first experiment within the project was to write a poetic response or version of an article that Ben Jennings and I had published on the folklore and heritage of Ilkley Moor. And I really enjoyed that, so I wanted to see how I could use poetry more in the research. And when I was reading the transcripts of the interviews that I'd done, I was struck by how evocatively and how emotionally people had described their views of Ilkley Moor. And usually this kind of interview data is written up for publication in academic journals with small quotes of people's words used to illustrate the researcher's interpretation of the data. And it can sometimes feel like it gets disconnected from the individuals and loses some of that emotional impact. So I experimented with an approach called poetic transcription, and put briefly, this is using the words and phrases from research interviews to make something akin to a found poem. So in terms of the process, what I did was take the written transcripts of the interview conversations. So that was, the interviews were recorded and I transcribed them word for word. And so I read and reread these transcripts and selected phrases from those which I felt really reflected something of the essence of how participants described them all. And then cut these out, as you can see on this image here, and rearrange these into a kind of poetic vignette whilst keeping true to the participants' own way of speaking, the rhythm of their speech. So I didn't add any words of my own, I didn't change any of their words. However, I did play around with the order of some of the images and phrases that they used. And the result is a selection of poems that I think speak to different aspects of the meaning of the peatland landscape of Ilkley Moor. I think it's a way of reflecting the complexity of how people feel about peatland heritage landscapes, and also a way into some of these more emotional aspects of how people engage with peatlands. So all the poems that I've read and I'm reading tonight have been shared with the participants to make sure that they're happy with what I've done with their words. Wouldn't use them if that wasn't the case. But I think for me, it's really an attempt to represent elements of the research in terms of how participants engaged with and thought about Ilkley Moor in a way that hopefully it brings it to life a little more for the reader. As I said, often an academic article will seek to explain what the interviewee has said, what the data means. And I think poetry gives us a chance to share the participants' experience, a way of stepping into the experience and feelings of another. So through the poems, it can also be a way of engaging people with peatlands and their heritage. So I'm just going to read two more poems before I finish, both of which speak to a sense of time depth of peatlands. And the first one I think speaks to the seasonal time of peatlands, forever changing. Along with the walking, you get the other things: birds, butterflies, dragonflies, frogs and toads, the little tarns, the changing seasons, weather conditions, how it's different every day. Last spring, when the weather was so beautiful, these green hair-streaked butterfly, metallic green, by the end of June they were gone. Cotton grass is so magic, white balls moving back and to in the wind like a sea. Different heathers look stunning in July. The bog asphodel, picking bilberries, passing on the love of the moor to the grandkids. Last autumn, the whole moor looked golden, so golden as you looked across the moor. Then you get misty days when you can't see anything. It's quite grey and dark in the winter, bleak and desolate. And then so beautiful with the white snow. It's that changing, the changing seasons, the mist, the sunshine, or the time of year. It's just forever changing. And the last poem I'm going to read gives a sense of a deeper archaeological time and that sense of continuous presence or relationship between people and peatlands. Footsteps. When you get onto the moors, there's a feeling of history, that you're treading in the footsteps of people from hundreds of thousands of years ago. The idea that land hasn't changed does make it a bit special. You might come across a rock and see these ancient marks, cup and ring marks, concentric circles, 3,500 years old. I just find that really magical. We've no idea what it means, why it was done. That idea of somebody being there and doing that, where you can just stand and see it, it just makes your spine tingle. So myself and Ben Jennings have been pulling the poems together onto postcards and posters to use at events, and we're hopefully going to bring them together into a pamphlet along with some of the images that have sat alongside the poems. Some of those are the images that the people who took part in the research shared with me and gave permission for me to use as well. And I'm hoping that the poems will prompt discussions about a different way of appreciating peatlands and their heritage, which acknowledges that emotional dimension and those personal narratives of how people influence peatlands and also how peatlands influence people today. I hope it's a way into the research for people who might not want to read academic publications. I hope that they'll prompt people to think about peatlands and what they mean to them, but also to recognise that the cultural heritage of peatlands isn't just something that adds interest to being in that landscape, but it's also part of why people care about these places. Peatland heritage can spark people's curiosity, and it's a part of what makes them meaningful, what makes a meaningful connection to these places. So it could potentially be a hook for engaging people in caring for the future of peatlands. The archaeologist Christina Fredengen talks about how encounters with peatland archaeology can create a sense of collapsed time, of deeper connections with the past. And she describes this as a way of re-enchanting our worlds, which I actually love that sense of re-enchantment. So I hope that by sharing research participants' experiences and encounters with peatland heritage through poetry, it allows others to experience a little bit of that re-enchantment that they've experienced. So on the slides are some publications from the research. They're all open access, none are behind a paywall. So please do download them and read them if you're interested. There's more underway. And I just wanted to end with a question really, to ask how you think poetry could be used to engage people with.
Thank you, Abby. I absolutely loved that technique that you used, pulling together these transcripts into poems. I thought it was really interesting because it kind of, I don't know, for me, it also really reminded me of the fact that like we often draw these binaries, and for us at RE-PEAT, we often talk about peatlands as these like non-binary spaces, and almost the fact that you're making this a creative and academic piece is really, seems really fitting to the topic of peatlands, and also just this idea that like it reminded me of the fact that peatlands are so condensed in time, like they hold all these like stories like so tightly together, and that's almost like how a poem holds meaning. It's like it's very condensed down, but you still translate, you still communicate all of this rich meaning. So I thought that was also really yeah, a nice way of communicating that research. And I think like we had an idea to talk about this. It connects nicely to your talk, I think, that we were reading about this book called Timefulness, which is about geology and the value of deep thinking. And I think Beth is going to read a little some quotes and just kind of follow on from what you were saying just quickly, and then we'll go into questions.
Yes, that's great.
It fits quite nicely.
And of course, if people are having reflections to Abby's, then also just go ahead in the chat as well while I'm speaking and stuff. So, Abby, did you want to say something else? No.
No,
I thought I cut you off. I thought maybe I cut you off. Maybe I cut someone else off. Sorry. Anyway, okay. So, yeah, basically, I'm just going to read a few things from this book, Timefulness, which I think kind of fits in pretty nicely with this kind of idea of kind of reaching into the past and making connections there. So there's a few bits that I've picked out that I'm going to read. So one of them is, I have sometimes felt as if I stood at the center of a circle, equidistant from all stages of my life, past and future. The sensation spills over to the landscape and rocks. Immersed in their stories, I see that the events of the past are still present and feel they could be replayed again one day in a beautiful revelation. This impression is a glimpse, not of timelessness, but of timefulness, an acute consciousness of how the world is made by and indeed of time. And then there's one little bit that I just also wanted to say that was kind of about rocks being verbs. So early on in an introductory geology course, one begins to understand that rocks are not nouns but verbs. Visible evidence of processes, a volcanic eruption, an accretion of a coral reef, the growth of a mountain belt. Everywhere one looks, rocks bear witness to events that unfolded over long stretches of time. Little by little, over more than 2 centuries, the local stories told by rocks in all parts of the world have been stitched together in a great global tapestry, the geologic timescale. And let's see if I find this final little bit. If widely adopted, an attitude of timefulness could transform our relationships with nature, our fellow humans, and ourselves, recognizing that our personal and cultural stories have always been embedded in larger, longer, and still elapsing Earth stories that might save us from environmental hubris. We might learn to place less value on novelty and disruption and develop respect for durability and resilience. So that's just a few little ideas from this book, Timefulness, that I think connect quite well. And maybe, we're speaking about rocks here, but then this one, I think also so many of these ideas go towards peatlands as well. So.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. That sounds like a really interesting book. I'll put it on my to-read list. It sounds really good. I think that idea of using the landscape as something active to think with as well, that I think comes through, that idea of projecting things like seeing rocks as verbs and things like that, seeing it as very active and living landscapes, really helpful.
I'm going to add the name. It's Marcia Bajornrud, just in case anyone wants to look it up. But did anyone have any questions directly for Abby before we close today? I can't see any straightforwardly in the chat, but you've got some nice comments of, I love these reflections from local people who love them more. It gives me hope for humanity. Yeah.
And I think what you were saying before about sort of the way that poetry can capture some of those plural voices, so that we're not telling the single story of a landscape that obviously doesn't have a single story. You know, there's so many attachments to it. So yeah, I think that sort of way that poetry can capture some of that plurality is really helpful.
I'm getting one question here. Can you say a bit more about the process of creating the poetry? Did it make you realize things differently?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Yeah, I think so. I think one of the things that I found most interesting as a researcher and looking at data, you know, I often look at interview data and analyze it, and actually thinking about the data poetically definitely added to the analysis process. So by looking particularly for things that struck me poetically and spoke to some of the emotional aspects of people's engagement with the landscape, but also evocative imagery that people used that stood out, I think definitely made me look at the data in a different way. It definitely added to the analysis and made it a lot richer. So yeah, it did make me look at the data differently.
There's another question from Rose. Abby, have you found that the form of your poetry has changed in order to capture a different kind of landscape and time?
Oh, this is a really interesting one, Rose, because it was a really different experience for me writing poetry with other people's words and other people's phrasing. So actually trying to then perhaps work with form as well as that was quite difficult. I found, I don't know if you spotted, but the Mother Nature poem was in tanka, which seemed to just fit the rhythm of that particular person's speech. But a lot of them ended up much freer because it was actually quite difficult to put them into a particular poetic form like a sonnet or something like that. But so I think it was more that the individuals, people's voices shaped the form of the poems. But I'm working on some more from it, which are combining words from different interviews that are all about the cultural heritage of the landscape. So combining those into a single poem and trying to look at some different poetic forms that I might be able to do that to give that a little bit more coherence. And certainly thinking about the landscape and the time periods that people are speaking about is influencing the shape of the poems. Yeah.
Fascinating. There's been a link posted for the book. Yeah, I think if anyone, nobody else has any questions, then we're just close today. But it's been really interesting. My brain is like so yeah. Thanks for everyone for joining and taking some time out of your busy lives to just be talking about peatlands and time. Yeah, Good evening, everyone, / wherever you are in the world, different time zones. Thanks, Abby, and thanks, Melanie. Bye, everyone.